The first golden age of the ancient Egyptians started about 5,000 years ago, which is a really flippin' long time. It's one of the oldest civilizations we have actual writings and knowledge of. So you can imagine they saw the world, reality, and state of the human soul quite differently from we do today. However, surprisingly, their beliefs in religion and magic aren't too off from pagans, witches, and occultists today. So, did they actually worship cats? What do these things mean? Let's find out. Love and light, death and darkness, I'm Jordan from Grimwire, and in this video, we'll be taking a trip back to ancient Egypt and looking at their religion, symbols, magic, and culture. In order to understand all of this video, it might help to watch the last one in the series, linked here. Don't worry, it'll take you back to this one, where we looked at the history of ancient Egypt going into modern times, what and when the three kingdoms were, and who were some of the most important pharaohs. These videos should each stand on their own, but they do lay the groundwork for the next 9 videos, in which we go over 40 of the most popular ancient Egyptian deities. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of them. Before we get on to the good stuff, a quick word from the Ancient Egyptian series sponsors, which is, oh yeah, me. I self-published a poetry book called Let's Imagine Our Own Meaning of Life and got it onto Amazon. If you have a few extra bucks, you dig romance and heartbreaks, and you want to help support me as well as this channel, check out the ebook for only $1.99 and be sure to leave a review, whether you liked it or not. Anyways, not to waste any more time. First, we're going to cover some big spiritual concepts, the worldview at the time, then look at some ancient spellwork, and finally move on to some symbols and animals, what they all meant to the ancient Egyptians to the best of our knowledge. Let's get started. Obviously, since the ancient Egyptians existed so long ago, they had a much different view of the way the world and everything worked. At the heart of this lays 2 very important concepts that were sometimes personified into deities, and that's Heka and Ma'at. Heka and Ma'at were both extremely important, and the only reason we're going over them here instead of in the sections on deities is that they kind of existed beyond just their deity forms. They were seen as concepts or forces that existed in the world and influenced and controlled everyday life, and really, they're vital to understanding just about anything the ancient Egyptians believed. First, we'll look at Heka. The name Heka is usually translated as magic, but can also be thought of as power. According to the World History Encyclopedia, Heka is probably the most important god in Egyptian mythology, but is often overlooked because his presence was so pervasive as to make him almost invisible to Egyptologists. The term Heka refers to 3 things, the first being the deity himself. There wasn't really any official cults or temples as opposed to most other gods, but he was believed to exist before creation and duality itself, and was used to create the universe and other gods. And although he's not really mentioned by name either, it's now understood that he was kind of the source of power for the gods. Heka can also refer to the force of magic itself. All beings, both deities and people, were thought to have some amount of this force. And it can also mean the actual practice of using that force to do symbolic actions and rituals, and have those have an effect on the real world. In other words, you would do the practice of Heka to use the force of Heka to change things, and Heka the deity was kinda in charge of all of that. Although the priest would not invoke the deity directly because he was present in the deities they were already serving. Heka was both the god of magic and medicine. It was one and the same, and it has a lot of parallels with modern magic and witchcraft. It wasn't magic instead of medicine, but they were complementary to each other. I'm actually constantly surprised how much the view of magic back then goes along with some of the views of witchcraft today. To the ancient Egyptians, magic wasn't a trick or illusion, but it was the ability to use natural laws to achieve certain goals. It was natural. It was what created the universe and kept everything going. It was what was present before the start of everything and at the end of it all, both your life and the universe. So, that's Heka, or magic. On to Ma'at. Ma'at is a little harder to translate directly into one word, but with a little meditation or contemplation, I think it can be grasped pretty easily as its own concept. Just as that, where harmony, balance, truth, justice, and order overlap and coincide. Ma'at, either as a deity or as a force, was said to uphold the order of the universe, so that everything didn't just eat each other or collapse upon itself. This was both through moral means, such as justice, but also natural means, such as the concept of making time go, and the stars stay in the sky. Ma'at in general represented something that the ancient Egyptians believed in, a unity, a force that held everything together in the universe. Part of the morality of Ma'at included playing a large part in the afterlife called du'a. The following is one of the more famous Egyptian myths. As a friendly reminder, the sun travels from east to west in the sky. To the ancient people, if you can imagine the sun completing the circle from west to east underneath the horizon, that was where Duat, or the afterlife, was. Ra, the sun god, was the one who made this trip, and two main things happened when he did so. The first being his nightly fight with Apep, or the great force of chaos. And this was the time when he shined his rays to the underworld, thus bringing everybody back to life, at least for the nighttime. Duat was a name for the overall afterlife, but more specifically the part of it where each human's heart, or ib, was judged by Anubis against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was lighter than a feather, i.e. it wasn't weighed down with guilt or wrongdoings, the soul was allowed to move through the trials and tests towards Aru, translated as field of reeds. And that was kind of like heaven or dreamland of an ancient Egyptian, meaning it was a land with rich, fertile soil, perfect for farming and hunting, where they pretty much just gotta chill with Osiris. At some points in time, this was done by stating the 42 negative confessions, which were essentially claims that you didn't do things, including a lot of things that we still pretty much agree makes a good person today, like I have not attacked any person, I have not been angry without just cause, I'm not a disturber of peace, but also some more superstitious things like I have not slain the cattle belonging to the gods, I have not cursed or blasphemed God, and I have not carried away the Kenfu cakes from the spirits of the dead. So, after reading these aloud, if the heart was heavier than a feather, the soul fell into the jaws of a deity-like figure named Ammit, part hippo, crocodile, and lion, all the big animals that the ancient Egyptians feared. The soul was either then said to face restlessness forever, or to just completely stop existing, depending on time and tradition. So that's the famous story of the underworld. Let's look more into that process, of the afterlife and state of the human soul. Taking it back for a second, the common view back then, as mentioned, was that the universe was created with and from Heka, and the little pool of Heka that got trapped in each human takes the form of a soul, of which there were many parts. Perhaps the easiest to understand is the Ket, the physical body, that which got left behind after death. The thing that left the body was called the Ka, or life essence, life force. Deities had Ka too, and just because it left the physical body doesn't mean it wasn't around anymore. The ancient Egyptians believed that food and drink sustained the Ka, and that was both A, why you needed food and drink to live, and B, why you left food and drink offerings for both deities and the deceased. I think that's a really interesting explanation for why you leave food and drink offerings, and one I didn't really know until researching this video. Anyways, the Ba is the personality, the individuality and vibe of a person, which was said to live on after death as well. I think this concept is the closest to that of a soul, the identifying feature that makes each person only them, and the perspective of each living being. The id, then, is kind of like a heart-mind, responsible for thought, intellect, will, and decisions. How we differentiate between the heart and mind, emotion and logic, they were one and the same to the ancient Egyptians. The ib was accessible in both life and death. This is the heart that was weighed against Ma'at. So in total, the view was that the Ka, or life essence, left the body on death, and the point of death rites and rituals, like creating mummies, were to help release the Ba from the body as well, so that it could go on too. The Ba fought through several little challenges in the pre-afterlife until it got to watch the heart, the ib, being weighed. If the heart was light enough, that allowed the Ka and Ba to reunite, creating the Ankh, or the kind of final afterlife version of a soul, which lived pleasantly forever after death. Good stuff, huh? The word for deity was neter, as opposed to remet, which meant people. But the word neter also applied to kings and dead peeps, so maybe like spirit could be applicable? Historians aren't sure where the word or belief comes from, or how the ancient Egyptians first started thinking of them. Were they personified forces of nature, or literal beings that lived in the clouds? We don't really know what they thought. Evidence of deity-like writing occurred way far back, during the early pre-dynastic times. Things like cows, which represented many deities, and stars, which obviously represented the night sky, but historians don't feel comfortable making a hard call until the falcon of Horus, crossed arrows of Neith, and the jackal of Set were found. All deities we'll be going over in the following videos, from times immediately preceding the first dynasty. Even though we don't really know how their concept of a deity started, most deities represented or personified things in the natural world, like Ra and Horus to the sun, or, in society, like Thoth to writing and science. But some were also connected to things in between, like certain deities or individual people having their own deity. Deities could expand to cover more than one thing, and more than one deity could cover the same thing. In general, most deities use some form of Heka to stand up for Ma'at. Magic back then was used similar to how it's used today, for luck, health, healing, protection, and fertility, even curses and summoning spirits to do your bidding. They used amulets and charms to help aid in their work, and even tattoos, too. Only a small amount of ancient Egyptians could actually read and write, so spells and magic that were written down were the most impressive and valuable type. Private collections were passed down within families, kind of like an ancient Book of Shadows. Also similar to today, they like to blame their enemies, bad spirits, and wrath of the gods on their bad luck or misfortunes, and a lot of magic was used for defensive or cleansing reasons. Spells typically had two parts. The first being words to be recited, which had to be pronounced correctly and in order to work, especially the names of deities. The words sometimes activated talismans or potions, or some spells contained text that was closer to a speech or play, in which the practitioner would act out like he was the deity of whatever was needed. The second part of spells were the actions to be done, like dancing, gesturing, and pointing. So yeah, like normal witchy stuff. I'd just like to give a quick reminder that I'm not necessarily recommending any of the following, just describing some of the things that were actually done and things that went into their magic. First, they viewed dawn as the best time to do magic, and they required a state of ritual purity, which would mean not doing some things like getting it on, and doing other things like bathing and wearing special clean clothes. We know of two ways that protective or healing spells were applied to the body. One way was writing the spell on papyrus, folding it up, and wearing it in pockets or under clothing close to the body part. The other technique was to draw images of deities directly onto the skin, which were then licked off. I have not heard of that one before, but could be fun, depending on who did the licking. On the more negative side, stomping, yelling, and banging on drums were said to drive away bad spirits. Sweet things like honey could also drive them away from somebody's body, or gross things like poop could help pull them out, because everyone knows demons love the poop. In order to curse, the names of people were written on clay pots or slabs, or figurines or drawings were created of them. And then they were spit on, trampled, stabbed, broken, burned, destroyed, whatever it took, Then, in at least a certain ritual, anything that remained was dissolved in urine. Magical figures could also be made from wax, and were thought to be more powerful if they had something personal from the target, such as hair, nail clippings, or bodily fluids. So, as you can see, if you're familiar with common modern spells and magic, it's really not too far off, which I find pretty neat. In this section, we're going to take a look at some symbols, some more literal, some less literal, like animals and colors. To start, we'll cover some things that are usually associated with deities. First up, as we've already talked a little bit about, is a feather of Ma'at. As we already covered what Ma'at means, one of her feathers is really just symbolic of her, in general, harmony, balance, truth. The feather is a really important Egyptian symbol and pops up quite a bit. One of the more popular modern symbols is the Eye of Horus, which is pretty famous. It stands for mostly protection, like having the Eye of Horus on you, like he's looking out for you. It also stands for help. Next up is the Eye of Ra, which is actually not a symbol in the same way the Eye of Horus is, but I see it discussed enough where it's worth mentioning here. Besides, we'll be mentioning it later as well. There's some misinformation I've seen out there where they're called the same thing, used interchangeably, or said to be mirrored aspects of each other. But an Eye of Ra is actually a title of which several deities received, most notably Bastet, Sekhmet, and Hathor, which, once again, we'll cover later. The Eyes of Ra were the feminine aspects of Ra, the guardians, said to be some of the most powerful deities, sent to Earth to carry out deeds in the supreme god's name. And a symbol of all the sun gods is the winged sun, which represents divinity, royalty, and power. Since ancient Egypt took the royalty very seriously, the symbols for royalty was taken very seriously as well. So much so that the crowns they wore were depicted being worn by deities and were featured by themselves as key parts of hieroglyphs. The two main guys are the Deshret and the Hedjet. The Deshret is the red crown of Lower Egypt, used by deities like Neith and Horus, while the Hedjet is the white crown of Upper Egypt. The Shenth is a combination of the Deshret and Hedjet, and is kind of like the highest crown of Egypt, used when the lower and upper lands of Egypt were united under one ruler. It was used by pharaohs mostly. Meanwhile, the Atef is a combination of the Hedjet with two feathers of Ma'at, and is often seen on Osiris. While the last crown worth talking about is the Kapresh, and is sometimes called the Crown of War, but that's not the most accurate name for it. This was worn by later pharaohs. Finally, we have some handheld objects, which are things that were pictured being held or carried by deities that were said to represent key parts of life and their power. The first is the Ankh. The Ankh, like the Eye of Horus, nowadays is almost synonymous with ancient Egypt. It's also a very old symbol going back to the first dynasty. It stands for and represents life, or life force, and is often seen held by pharaohs and powerful deities to show their control and mastery over life. We also have the Waz scepter, which was associated with deities like Set and Anubis, as well as pharaohs in general. It means power. We also have the Djed pillar, which is associated with Osiris, both literally and metaphorically, meaning a backbone, or stability. And finally, we have the crook and flail. The crook standing for royalty, and the flail for fertility. They were mostly seen with Osiris too. Now that we have those covered, we can move on to a pretty fun section, or the animals. It's pretty much unanimous that the ancient Egyptians had a much wider range of pets than we consider today. And it's also agreed that they loved and took care of them very similarly too. First, we have to cover cats. Cats were incredibly important to the ancient Egyptians. They were found as far back as the First Dynasty, and evidence shows they got more important as time went on. Both literally and symbolically protective, they were praised for hunting venomous snakes and protecting the pharaohs. They were also said to represent justice, fertility, and power, and they were a symbol of many deities, especially the Eyes of Ra, Bastet and Sekhmet. So, cats weren't literally worshipped, but they were considered sacred and thought to have powers similar to the powerful deities that were represented by them. They were mummified and buried with their owners, or in special cat cemeteries. And, just because I finally have an excuse to show cat pictures in one of my videos, the two most common species found mummified were the African wildcat and the jungle cat. Also, here's some other related images, including a fun blue boy statue from about 1900 BC, a bronze statue of a cat and their kitten from about 600 BC, and finally, a brave protective kitty. And the last thing to say about cats, and probably my favorite fun fact, is that the name they were called was that, spelled MJW in phonetics, which was likely pronounced mew, which Egyptologists totally believe comes from the sound of their meow. That's pretty flippin' awesome. Even though we think of cats when we think of ancient Egypt, dogs were considered pretty awesome to them too, and were found mummified with their owners as similar to cats. Also like cats, they were named after the noise they made. In this case, IWIW, as far as I can tell, is pronounced au au. A very popular deity was Anubis. He was a deity of the underworld, and is linked to be either a jackal or a dog. So, Cats and dogs are by far the most common, but birds were pretty popular too, including falcons, which were very popular as they represented the sun god Horus and his power, while the ibis was representative of Thoth, wisdom and knowledge, and kept by higher class individuals. In fact, 500,000 mummified ibises, were found at one site, close to the Great Pyramids of Giza. Another interesting animal that was kept as a pet was actually crocodiles, which represented Sobek, a creator and protector god. I can't really find much verification that they were kept as home pets, but were certainly kept, bred, and mummified a little more professionally in temples. Interestingly, hippos were also sometimes kept as pets in the same light, as kind of a show over the chaotic, dangerous forces of nature. Also, baboons were sometimes kept, similarly to ibises, as a symbol of Thoth, but apparently monkeys in general were pretty common pets. Finally, cows appeared as much more symbolic animals, representative of many mother deities such as Nia, and not as much pets. However, they were considered delicacies to eat. And lastly, let's cover some colors, because it's kind of interesting how it contrasts to today. In modern terms, we typically have the association that white equals good, and dark equals black equals bad. Not only is that low-key racist, it's also kind of the opposite for the ancient Egyptians. Black actually stood for good things and order, and that's because of the black, fertile soil of the Nile and how it provided so much nourishment and was literally necessary for life. Red was actually the evil color, and this was because of the dry, harsh heat of the desert. Green represented fertility in plants, their growth, and agriculture in general. And this is a good time to bring up the skin colors of deities and images, which were painted symbolically. Osiris was painted green because of this fertility aspect, and sky and water deities were painted blue. Most of the others were painted gold because of sun or royalty associations. This is frequently mistakenly interpreted to mean that the ancient Egyptian skin was this light in color, which it wasn't. There's literally a whole long Wikipedia entry about the controversy of the skin color of ancient Egyptians. They were a North African culture, which is important to remember, and most scholarly opinions certainly agree they weren't white, and a lot agree they weren't necessarily what we'd call black, although they were close enough to black African populations such as the Kushites from Nubia to have some darker skin tones in general. Anyways, in the next part of this series, we're going to start looking at the deities of ancient Egypt, starting with the primordial powers of darkness, infinity, and invisibility. Before you go, if you like this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. That actually helps my channel a ton. Then, if you want to join the Grimwire gang, like Cleo Luna did, and want to get a chance to get a shout out in a video like this, be sure to subscribe, click the bell, and then let me know you did so in the comments. Either way, thanks for watching, friends. I'll see you around.